Okay, I just submitted. I just submitted a request for a new USC card, so hopefully it'll go through.
Cool. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Vincent. We're just going to wait a few more moments for people to come in. We'll see. All right, we'll wait one more minute. All right, let's get this going. Hey, Vincent. So we do every other week VR or kind of interesting talks. We look at literature and then kind of digest it and think about how we can apply that to like media creation or just inform us as creators on interesting topics. So we've gone over everything from like virtual embodiment and kind of the state of virtual reality and how it's being used for patient education for breast cancer patients to how in VR false memories can be implanted in children. To this week, we're looking at dance and how augmented sensory information can breed like essentially a new sense, or for example in this paper, how the sense of touch can be enhanced to have someone who is blind see a dance. And so let me share the paper. And as usual, I reached out to the author of the paper and told them that we were on LinkedIn. I told them that we were doing this journal club and I invited him, John McCormick, and he did not show. So that's all good. But someday the authors will show up and that will be really funny. So anyway, there is a lot of research actually in neuroscience about the augmentation of sensory information. So they get blind people to hear a tone. Essentially, in many ways, it's actually classic conditioning. They get blind people to hear a tone during a specific emotion or sensory, um, like pairing a tone with a sense of touch, and then like seeing how the brain adapts to those things, likely using MRI techniques. And I can dig deeper on that. But one thing that I do want to stress, mostly, I don't know if Vincent, if you're interested in coming in 2 weeks, but to Christina and the other people that are going to come in, that it's always, in my opinion, important to look at the reference notes. And then I would like people that are participating to highlight one other paper that they think is important, because whenever you're doing like literature reviews or reading about a study, it's always like, how deep do you want to go? And so if this author McCormick is citing this paper, then like I'm going to like dig deeper into that. So anyway, let's talk more about the paper. So they had blind participants either have somebody touching their back, kind of mimicking the emotional sensation, like an interpreter essentially of a dance. And then that person, the blind person, has this new capability of like feeling via sensory input, haptic input, what that dancer is representing. And then for this study, they made like a cushion, a back cushion, where using motion capture, they would get the form of the person dancing corresponding to these little slots. And then as that person moved, those slots would compress onto the person's back, like illustrating the position of that dancer through that space. So I highlighted just the flow, the methodology here on figure 2. And I also really think it's interesting that they used the Unity game engine to do so. That's like a software development tool for VR development. But there was like some really interesting topics that I would like to dig deeper in. Like, for example, social haptics is defined as interaction of 2 or more people in a social context, or messaging are conveyed using a sense of touch. Touch is used as a means of communicating information with the aim of providing a more holistic and environmental view of the world. And then back to those translators, they manipulate the arms and postures of the visually impaired to choreograph. That often occurs in dance or training and choreographic process to transfer dance knowledge. I think that's really interesting.
It's, for me, looking at this, for someone who's created work before for stage, this is kind of like an additional level of how you can incorporate the audience members to actually experience the movement. Because you have to understand, like, when you're going to go watch a show, like we've all seen a movie before, you sit there and you just kind of like watch. That's normally how a performance goes, no matter where you go, especially for dance. So to have some sort of interactive tool, it kind of brought me to, have you been to Disneyland and gone to the Bugs Life exhibit where there's like these little things that poke you? That's what
Yeah.
it kind of reminded me of, and it gave me that added layer of like, how do you continue to interact with the audience while also keeping them engaged? But from this perspective, I thought, in my mind, I thought it was a little weird. Like, why would we need to show or give them an experience that is an outline of a dancer when there's so much more to dance than just like the form, you know?
Mm-hmm.
There's the intent, there's speed, you know, there's all these other physics and variables that go along with it. Like, why is form the way we can do this? And I'm realizing it's because of the limitations of the capture tools, right? Because we're using capture tools to effectively translate that into data. The data is being interpreted as shapes within the computer, and then that's being transmitted back into the haptic cushion so that they can actually experience the piece. But it's like, in my mind, I'm like, well, are they actually experiencing the piece? You know, like how do you continue to add layers for them to actually experience things? Like for example, when you think of theater and performance, there's also an emotional component too. Like how do you convey that while also adding the layer of like touch, right? Like you can do heat, you can do cold, you can do air. Like there's so many ways to do that. It's just a matter of like how do you, kind of like with American Sign Language or sign language in general, there are these kind of like keys and values that go along with the language. But how do you standardize that across haptics in general, right? And that's difficult. So my mind kind of went a lot of different places with this article, especially with I guess the tooling that goes along with providing these experiences for the deaf, deaf-blind, and blind.
Yeah, that's great feedback, especially like with your background as a professional dancer. I thought like you would really appreciate this. And you mentioned that you knew people that were already kind of implementing similar techniques or researchers that were implementing stuff like this.
Yeah, there was a in terms of like VR and AR, I knew there was a couple choreographers like maybe 6, 7 years ago who were implementing these new technologies for people to experience the piece without having to be there. Because dance is a lot of like, on one hand, sorry, I have to break this down. Dance is very much like, oh, it's in the moment, you're in the space, it'll never exist ever again in this place. And I'm just like, okay, well, VR kind of branches, like removes that, but it makes technology makes the pieces now in a whole different category. Like I was explaining to you before, Max, there's an entire section on dance for camera where people can experience dance pieces in very specific ways, and the choreographer can show you what they want you to see, right? Like they want to emphasis like a gesture or an accent or a motif. But now with these new toolings and thinking about how they're utilizing them, I'm just like, well, this is this what this piece, what this not this piece, this paper is really trying to do is how to demonstrate inclusion in kind of performing arts and in that like emotional space,
Hmm.
you know, which is kind of a hard play, you know, like it, it's I don't know how to convey it, but it's like it's wonderful that we want to create these inclusive experiences. But if I'm going to give you a glass of orange juice or an orange, you know, and the best thing I have is like powdered lemon juice, you know, is that really the kind of the same experience, you know, like,
Yeah.
so I think it's interesting like to strip it away, you know, give everybody the same exact experience, so no matter what, this piece is kind of like it only exists in this kind of like box. So I think that's very interesting. Sorry, I went on a weird tangent.
No, no, no.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because you think, I guess it feels like there's a natural desire to want to translate things. So, oh, we have this dance and people are seeing it, appreciating it, and feeling it, and there are all of these people who can't. How do we translate it into something that they can experience? But I think that's maybe the wrong way to approach it. Maybe the better way to approach it is, what can you create with this technology that has its own emotional resonance and its own story and its own feeling, and it, instead of being sort of a watered down version of something else, how can you make it its own full experience? And I think like you mentioned with experiences like A Bug's Life 4D, it's adding something as opposed to trying to compensate for something that isn't there. And I think it will be really interesting to see what creative people do with this technology that's completely novel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder what these blind, deaf, or visually impaired individuals think of it. You know, like do they, if we were to like say like how would you rate this experience? Would they say that this is like a really shallow, like that's cool, but like like I still have no idea like what that person is doing and there's no way. But in lieu of like, if they're missing sensory information, if they just don't have the you know the brain capacity to do that, what means do we have to add to their existing capabilities. Like you mentioned, you know, access. We want to provide accessibility to one piece of art form to someone that can't physically engage in that art form. But like Vincent, what you said is they're missing um, the visual capability, right? And so like here it says they're able to successfully convey a sense of spatial volume, but in dance it's much more than just like spatial relationships, right? There's like the emotion. How do you convey emotion along with those things? Um, so I think in general it's really interesting, and I actually did want to share this guy. I talked about him the other day in class. But are you guys familiar with Neil Harbison?
I was just about to ask you if you've seen this because that's what this project reminded me of. It's a sort of compensatory tool the way that this is. Um,
Yeah. So are you familiar with Neil, Vincent?
Yeah, I've seen him pop around on my feed a couple times. It's strange. It's for me. It's like this kind of intersection of cyborging, you know, is very much spectacle right now, and so that's why I'm just like always like this is bullshit. Like this is like like if you think about it, a cyborg is just someone who has like a mechanical component in their body. So people who have pacemakers or like an artificial knee or a hip, like those are cyborgs. But because it's a spectacle and you can actually see it, people are so in awe with it, and I'm just like, this is stupid. You know, like this is a publicity stunt, and not to say that it's drawing away from what he's doing, but it's like it's it's so weirdly elitist in my mind, and I don't know how I feel about it.
yeah, I
Also,
mean, I think it's,
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think it's strange to call him like the world's first cyborg because we're all kind of cyborgs now. Like we're externalizing our memory, right? It used to be that you'd have to remember like, oh, that one guy in that movie is this person, or like the whatever 32nd president of the US was this person. But now you don't have to remember anything except for to bring your phone with you. And so I think given that our relationship with technology has changed so much, it feels strange to be like, this guy is the first one. Um, but I do think that the technology itself is really interesting. Um, I think it's being given to people with achromatopsia for free, which is really great. I tried to use it in a project one time and I could not get my hands on one, which is probably for the best. But I think it's so cool to see how people have both been augmenting their senses that they were born with, but also compensating for the ones that maybe they don't have.
Yeah, and so I know you guys are familiar. Oh, but Vincent, we do post these on YouTube if that's cool with you. If it's not, we don't have to post it. um, but so this guy, this Neil Harbison, is colorblind, and what he did essentially is got like a spectrometer, like a light sensing camera, and put it on his head, and in kind of a spectacle way that you were talking about, Vincent. So it is he definitely like hyped up his I am a first human cyborg, I'm an artist, and you know, has his TED talk, and so you know, whatever, good for him. But they get the light that he physically can't see, and all light actually, and associates it with a tone. So he hears color essentially. The interesting thing here is that, in my opinion, is although I do think he's kind of like hype machine, his brain is changing based on that input. He is classically conditioning his brain. So now that he sees any color, whether it's in the spectrum that he can see or he can't, he's associating that with the tone. And so he may have an ability now that we don't have. Like he can see and hear colors because he's trained his brain to do so. And we maybe we think it's hype because we haven't trained our brain to adapt to those stimuli. Um, yeah, I just think that's an interesting food for thought. But let me jump back to the journal.
So
You go
it's
on
interesting.
this.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna
No, I
say
was going to take us on a tangent. So
no worries. I was gonna do the same thing, but what I wanted to say was I think it's interesting with the whole haptics thing on the back because if you're talking about augmenting your senses so you can experience something else, tap or haptics are great just to I guess register that something is going on, right? That's what haptics do. But it's like, how do you do that with depth perception? You know, like for someone who's unable to see, like what can you do besides the back to perceive depth? You know, is that, do you use air to blow on your face? Like, are you able to use like other pieces of haptics to illustrate, you know, how high a person is jumping with this kind of technology, or relative to they are in the space? So I think for me the component is missing is still the space portion of it, because with dance and theater the stage is like the most important part, you know, like to be able to understand like the distance once traveled or the physical ability of someone being able to jump. That's so important. Well, in theory, right, it's important. I mean, dance can be whatever the fuck you want, but it's I'm just curious to see how at some point, if they're really catering to all masses to experience dance in a certain way, how do you convey depth in that regard? So sorry, my tangent's over.
it seems like you'd have to involve the vestibular system, right? Like you'd have to be able to have that feeling of um, falling and getting dizzy. And, you know, if you could tap into that, it might be easier to communicate. Um, this person has jumped really high or spun a bunch of times in a circle or something.
That's interesting. For me as a choreographer, I'm thinking about it like, well, how am I able to show someone space without them seeing or hearing or whatever that looks like? And my mind went to like roller coaster, you know. Or when you said vestibular system, I thought like, well, there are crystals in your ear that regulate like what your I guess up and down and your perception of like the horizon and whatnot. Like, how can you perceive that as well? And I'm like, well, you can spin someone on a chair. Like, there are things that you can do to engage the vestibular system that, I mean, granted, I don't know how it exactly works with people who are deaf or deaf blind, but I'm wondering, like, can you apply those experiences in addition to this haptic system so they can experience as well?
I imagine that you would be able to, at least for most people, if you have a form of deafness that impacts like the structure of the ear, maybe you couldn't. Um, but it feels like for most deaf people, you should be able to do something that would activate that system.
Well, what Beethoven's famous for laying on the floor, right, while his music was being played, and so he could feel the vibrations through the floor. In conjunction, I was thinking about bone conduction bone conduction speakers. So there's some research on like fighter pilots that stimulation to the like right behind the ear, the bone right behind the ear, helps fighter pilots reduce motion sickness. And so I think there's a lot of VR systems now that are trying to do that. Instead of having speakers, have it through the bone conduction, which in turn can help fight motion sickness in VR content. So that's what I instantly thought of when you were thinking about like the vestibular system and messing with people's like balance and idea of balance. But that would be crazy if you could like implement those things. But Vincent, you were talking about like depth and height and everything, and this paper definitely acknowledges that limitation. They're saying that essentially like the actuators, so the amount of those little pins that press against their back, it's just binary. It's either go or no go. So they don't have like as much sensitivity, research into sensitivity actuators, strength, fatigue, discrimination, or point separation are other factors that will inform future iterations. So yeah, I think this is like pretty basic, this pad here, but I think it's really interesting in ways that we can enhance or like mess with different sensory information. Yeah, go ahead. Was there anything that anyone else thought was particularly interesting in this paper?
I just think haptics in general is a really interesting field, because for virtual reality as a whole, it's been something that I think a lot of companies have tried to work out, but that up to this point we haven't been very good at implementing. And I think that's interesting because it feels like it should be a pretty easy problem to solve. Like, oh, you pick something up and you get some sort of like feedback response that tells you that you're holding something, or like, you know, you get hit by a like virtual object and you feel it in real life. But it's so complicated to implement in a way that feels real and authentic. And so this kind of research is really interesting, not just for its intended purpose, but I think also for understanding how we relate to haptic feedback in general and what else can be done with it.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is like the fusion of sensory information, and like how can we train the brain to adapt across those things. So like the brain is always changing, the brain is always adapting. You know, they say like Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder can, because they don't have their vision, essentially their occipital lobe has kind of been dominated by their auditory functioning. So like they can hear better, and that is a product of their brain adapting to a part of their brain that isn't being used for their vision. So I think something like this, where we can't replace a sense per se, but we can definitely try to utilize what people can feel and and change the way that they perceive those things. Maybe again, maybe not like replacing it, but changing it, and that is represented in a physiological change as well, not just like emotional. And the more that you do those things, the more the brain changes, the more adaptable and open you are to those changes. And so how can we utilize this in VR or in media? You know, like our project with the MRI is about like having someone feel like they've been transported to a radiology suite, to a MRI, so that they feel, when they're actually there, they feel like it's a familiar place, like it's not so scary. And we've talked about Mel Slater's work in previous weeks about how if you embody an avatar that's of a different race, then when you come out of this VR experience, you have more empathy towards that person of that race. You have less perceived prejudice. It's like, this is definitely like a tool to like change the way that we perceive ourselves, the world, and that can include sensory information. And the fact that it's being used for people that are missing a sense is like pretty interesting, and like proxies of like conveying meaning when you don't have a measurement tool to absorb that meaning. I think it's super interesting.
That's interesting too, because it reminds me of people that have synesthesia, which is, instead of missing a sense, two of your senses get linked. And they think that that happens because the brain doesn't prune that connection when it's supposed to. And so lots and lots of kids experience this, but not a ton of teenagers or adults. But this line of thinking makes me curious about whether you could like repair that link, or create synesthesia in people who don't naturally have it. Because if you can train your brain to do like other forms of connections, it seems like that would be something that, I guess it feels like that would be something that's doable as well. I don't know if there's any good reason to do it, but as a like thought experiment, that's really interesting to me.
Well, you heard of the guy that was in VR for a week, right? He stayed in VR for a week. Yeah, yeah, he wore a headset night and day
How did that
in
work?
VR. What was that?
Like, how did that work? Like, was I assume this man had a job and he had to do normal adult things? Like, what do you like? What do
No,
you?
no, I don't think he had a job. I think he just like stayed at home just due to the limitations of VR. And actually, I mean, uh, like HP has like these backpacks that you could run a VR headset on theoretically and just like walk through space. So like if you had if you created a model of your apartment or whatever USE and then like made and then yeah, it'd be nuts. Like what if what if you like saw induced synesthesia by like having haptic feedback, like what this guy Neil Harbison did. You combined sensory information when normally we only have a certain type. Like what the hell would happen? That'd be nuts.
My biggest concern is like the brain doesn't do well chemically when you remove something, right? Like people go into depression, people have these things. That's why people are so drawn to like Molly and these drugs because it alters the chemical, um, neurochemical balances to be good for them, right? Whatever that means. So I'm wondering, like, if this guy removed the antenna from his head, like out of nowhere, with no like desensitizing his mental ability, or someone who's experiencing VR for a week and trying to enable synesthesia, how do you your body must freak out, like it's the same thing with the frame rate of these VR consoles. Like if you turn it up to a certain point, your brain starts to fucking wig out and is like, this is not okay, or this is like either too real or something's going on where it's like perception of reality is like skewed. So what do you do when that happens? That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, what do you do if someone's blind and deaf and then you give them a means to like feel something that they can't feel? Like what happens when you take that away as well? Like let's say they super value it and like I am now capable of seeing what I can't see, and then the research study is over and now you take those things away from somebody. What are the ethical implications of that as well?
I mean, I think it's like people who receive cochlear implants, right? So they didn't have the ability to hear for a period of their life. And then they get that ability either for the first time or they get that ability back. And for a lot of people who that happens to, it's really uncomfortable to adjust to having that new sensory information because they don't know what to do with it. But then on the other hand, if you take it away from them, it's like losing a sense. And I think that's something that needs to be taken very seriously when we consider like transhuman or like cyborg augmentations is our bodies get used to it and then it's part of you and you can't just get rid of it. You have to adjust to losing a sense the way that you adjusted to having a new sense. And I think you see that even with people who like do like transdermic implants and stuff like that, where they have like magnets in their fingertips. Like you get used to having this new sense that's you can sense magnetic fields, and is it particularly useful? Not really, except for some people who need that for like the jobs that they have. But if you take those away, people get really freaked out because it's something that they've gotten used to being able to do. And so to take away something after a clinical study ends without preparing people, I think is an ethical violation.
I didn't know that people were putting magnets in their fingertips. How would you even use a credit card?
Oh,
So,
it creates a lot more problems than it solves, I think. Um, and I think people mostly do it to be like, the most badass, like transhuman in their group of transhuman friends or whatever. It's like a performance art thing, but it's real and it tells us a weird amount about how we adjust to new sensory information.
I mean, it's like when the astronauts come back from space, right? Like you see some of them who are like think that they're still out in the orbit, and they drop a pencil and they think it's going to float, but in reality they're realizing that gravity still applies to them because they're on Earth. Like the body will adapt, but I guess it's conditional, or like reaffirming condition, or what's the term? Conditioning, I guess, in general. Like you're just reconditioning the body to the norms of where you are.
Yeah, well, and I think you see that even in just regular virtual reality headsets. Like, I think I've told this story in one of these meetings before, but I once played Diner Duo for so long that I tried to lean on the counter to throw something so I could get like better leverage. And the counter obviously was not there in real space. And so I just like fell. Um, and that wasn't even after that long. I must have been in there for like 30 minutes maybe, but your brain adjusts very quickly to this idea that like this is our new reality. Things here work the same way that they do in real life. Um, and if you're not paying attention, it becomes really easy to acclimate to that and then to treat everything like it's normal.
so does that make VR like a potentially dangerous tool?
Yes, I have injured myself in VR. But I guess that was everything.
You
Yeah, I
know,
guess.
physically speaking, like your body has limiters within it, right? So when you're putting yourself in this new world where you don't fully understand, or your brain doesn't fully understand the rules and the physics along with it, but you're still playing with it, your body does some weird things. Like if you're going to expect to experience the same kind of reality within a different space if you're like fully immersed. So it's like you can really hurt yourself, like muscularly, like obviously.
Yeah. But like you mentioned, like if you can alter that space, like, and there's things that if you're physically in VR, if you're able to manipulate people's perceptions of themselves and the world, and you have essentially a tool that can manipulate their sensory input, like what are the possibilities of the way that they look at their new reality, of quite literally a new like virtual reality. And like some people have embraced that more than others, like Second Life or like games like that. um it's just interesting. And like if you're able to modify, augment, improve, or take away sensory information, um and we've talked about like cyborgs, about like biologically altering those things, what does the future look like? What does the future look like for man, media, and robots? Who knows?
So when thinking about this entire experience, like this, the initial proposal was for people who are deaf, blind, and blind, which are three separate things, to experience, what we experience, who are, I guess, native, with all five senses. Like, I'm from an ethics standpoint, I'm not trying to be that person, but why is that important? Like I'm just trying to figure out, I think in my mind, like these people, it's their norm, right? Like they already navigate in that space on a daily basis. Like augmenting and adding haptic feedback systems is very beneficial, I think, across the board. But like, what are the actual uses for this technology besides like performance, you know, like can they turn on a light with it, you know, look at, can they speak with it, like what is enhancing their abilities, you know, like what tooling actually does that.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that. Thank you for reminding me about Christina's topic about cochlear implants. There's actually a big movement of people that are missing their hearing. Like they're proposing preventing people from implanting cochlear implants because they think that, you know, there's nothing wrong with not having the ability to hear, that they live just as fruitful, meaningful lives. Don't like prevent yourself or your child, don't do it to yourself or your child. There's nothing wrong with that. And they think that like putting in a cochlear implant is like reducing the culture, or the reducing, you know, saying there's something wrong with that. And so I don't know, you can agree or disagree with that, but I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, what's wrong with those people? Um, what's what added benefit does it if it's not really a disability, if someone can still like live a fruitful, happy life?
Yeah, like why, not that my experiences are impeding on their experiences, but I think there's a natural human connection where people just want people to experience the same things because it's so cool, or it's like so important for their experience, so they want other people to benefit, which is fine. But I don't think everyone, this sounds awful, I don't think everyone needs to, if it's their norm from a, I guess, a physiological or biological standpoint, why do we need to augment it so that we feel like they can experience it, right? Like what are the experiences that they actually want, you know? That's kind of where my head is at. And the only reason why I bring it up is because in this article, I thought it was interesting because not a lot of people read Braille at all. Like it's not a big thing. And so I was fascinated with the fact that the right here, I think it says 54% to 100% depending on level of Braille proficiency. Like how, at that point you're really limiting your market, right, of people who can actually experience some of these experiences, because if you can't read Braille, like, well, then you're fucked, you know, like you can't really experience this experience, so you're further segregating a different kind of like audience. So again, it's like how, I think from the empathetic point of view, like how do we bring them into the mix with these experiences and truly give them the things that they want, you know? It's, these research papers are great, but it's like, are we at that point treating them like real test subjects because they're lacking something that we have? Like, how can we better create these experiences where they want to experience something and we provide it to them and based on their initial feedback? I don't know. That's strange, but kind of like where my mind is at with this.
I mean, I do think it's worth recognizing that the percentage of people who are deaf or deafblind who are against medical interventions to restore senses is a pretty small community. And I think that there are a lot of people who would say that they wish they could experience a dance show with their hearing or sighted friends and family, or they wish that they could. And I mean, that also, I think, depends on the level of integration that you have into sort of the abled world. I think what's unique about the deaf community is there are sections of the deaf community that are insular. So they've created their own culture, their own traditions, their own language. Like there's a version of sign language called Martha's Vineyard Sign Language that's particular to Martha's Vineyard Island off the coast of Massachusetts. Because that community historically has been a really large deaf population, that's its entirely own culture. And I think for people that don't have a group, don't have a culture, they're more likely to want to be able to interact with and engage in the world the way that the people around them do. Which doesn't really solve the problem of like, well, this particular system relies on Braille. If you don't speak Braille or you don't read Braille, it's not very useful. But I think that there is a real desire for these type of products.
Not to get too postmodern, but then isn't it also like the creation of like an other, or of like a normative versus someone that's like not normal? See the point, but I think that also kind of goes back to the cochlear implant community's point, where it's like it's okay to be who we are, and you don't have to want to be like a normal person, or like a whatever, like I don't know. I mean, again, I don't really agree with that in many ways, but then in some ways I look back historically, and like that same idea was applied to like Native Americans, or to Black people, or like the Gullah dialect, right? And like in like Louisiana, or like or even in like in LA, like 70, 60 years ago, they're like, don't speak Spanish, speak English. That's like who we are. That's who you should be. Um, so yeah, off topic. I don't mean to like get into like that, but it is like super interesting. Um, and yeah, I pulled this from a journal called Leonardo. And it's really interesting because it's in USC's libraries. You can look up all of them for the last several years, but all of their articles are based on art, technology, and like science, essentially. So I'd highly recommend you like looking through it and like seeing what topics are interested to you. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I didn't mean to squish the conversation, but I did also want to like respect time. We have about 10 minutes left. Does anyone want to have anything else that they want to add?
I think from a I think of Imagineering and I think of Disney when I read this article, just because they're kind of like the proponent for experience design in my mind, because they're on a day to day they provide these experiences that are holistic across communities, and they try to be very inclusive. So in my mind, I'm thinking like, well, if Disney Imagineering came in and tried to utilize this technology, how would they implement it? And I'm just fascinated by the fact that people want to create these new experiences that are kind of out of the box, like it's kind of like making a cake and then making a cake pop. Like you take these ingredients and you make it into a cake, but then you destroy the cake by crumbling it up and adding frosting and making something else. It's kind of like deconstructing, constructing, deconstructing, restructuring. So I'm wondering like how will this technology like reconstruct itself? Like what does the second iteration look like? So I'm very excited to see like if they pursue this farther, because my mind is like spinning on this kind of like multi-sensory approach to dance experience or experiences in general.
Speaking of Disney Imagineers, Christina, did you want to talk about, did this ever come into discussion when you were with the Imagineering team?
What, haptics?
Multimodal sensory inputs, and children, you're working on the Children's Hospital Initiative, but like inclusion and things along those lines.
I'm gonna be honest, and I probably shouldn't be because we're recording this, but
Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't say anything. Don't say anything.
No, but I mean, it is a concern that Imagineering has had for sure, because you want to create experiences that are, I mean, you're creating experiences that are first and foremost social. And social experiences are only as effective as everyone's ability to participate in them. So Imagineering puts a lot of effort into trying to figure out, well, okay, all of our guests are going to have different needs. How can we work to accommodate those? And I think they've been pretty successful. in making it a place that everyone can go. The thing that I think is maybe the most impressive is the number of autistic people that really love Disneyland, because you would think that it's somewhere that people with autism would hate. It's loud, it's crowded, there's stuff going on everywhere, all of your senses are being, bombarded at all times. But the way that they've crafted that experience makes it so that it's tolerable, or that the things that you as an individual would need to do to be able to experience it like the people around you is really minimal. Like maybe you wear headphones so that one of your senses is kind of knocked out and you can focus on everything else. But they make a really concerted effort to include people who have disabilities or have particular needs. Haptics, from an engineering standpoint, are very frustrating, which is why they don't use them as much as you might expect, because that sort of technology breaks down and then it's hard to fix. But I think if you could have a haptic backpack or whatever that you could rent out to people, what could you do with that? What could you change? How could you make these experiences something that people who right now aren't going to any of the Disney parks could experience? It's really interesting. I'm gonna noodle on what I would do with this technology, because it's I don't know, I'm really curious about it.
So, Christina, this is the first time we've ever met. Are you an Imagineer? Like,
I was, yeah.
that's amazing. Congrats. Sorry, I have a friend who is the first Latina Imagineer at Disney. She did the Star Wars ride, and I'm just so fascinated by women in the Imagineering space, because I'm like, that is such a cool fucking place to be. So applause to you, man. That's great.
It was a lot of fun. If you're ever in Children's Hospital Los Angeles, my work is in there now.
I'm gonna check it out. I'm gonna actually fly in a couple of weeks, so I'm gonna have to hit you up for that.
Please.
Stop by Irving and Young when you're around. We'll be here. Okay. Any last thoughts before we close it up? Okay, thanks, Vincent, for coming. And in 2 weeks' time, Christina, you're going to pick the next article, and we'll share it then. Vincent, do you want to stay on the list?
Yeah, I'm down for it. Let's do
All
it.
right. Right on. Okay, we will see everybody in 2 weeks' time.
Hi, good to meet you, Vincent.
Bye, y'all.